Welcome to In Touch. I'm Lucy Sondel with David Rodich, and singing for us was Fred Waring. This is how I know from the album. Okay, David, why Fred Waring?
Well, Lucy, I thought because of the recent developments since the last time we were together in our country, it would be fitting to open with our national hymn, God of Our Fathers, which was conducted by Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians. Fred Waring was a very popular band leader in the 1930s and 40s, and in the 1950s had his own television show. And what we saw in our opening was a segment from one of those shows. But besides the idea of national pride and identity, Fred Waring has another connection with Wadsworth history. I don't suppose that surprises you.
Nothing surprises me anymore.
A man who was very well known in Wadsworth music circles, studied under Fred Waring. This is a 1947 yearbook, The Whisperer.
I hold this for you.
If you want to open that.
Okay.
And the class of 1947 dedicated their yearbook to Kingsley Sears, who was the choral director of the high school at that time and continued to be for several decades thereafter. Kingsley Sears was born in Creston. His father was a Methodist minister, and of course they traveled around a lot. But the Sears family was originally from Wadsworth. Kingsley Sears' grandfather, Earl Sears, settled a farm just north of Clark's Corners that's still known by older residents as the Sears Farm, though of course it's changed ownership many times. And he came right around the time of the Civil War and raised his family on that farm. And one of his sons, the Reverend Schuyler Sears, that we'll talk about a little later, was Kingsley Sears' father. And after graduating from high school, Kingsley Sears went on the road, traveled playing with different bands and different groups, and unfortunately he contracted a severe illness that caused him to be confined to bed for some time. And he returned to his grandfather's farm here in Wadsworth, where he was nursed back to health. And when he regained his health, the doctors advised him that it was not a good idea that he keep up the strenuous life on the road as a musician. And so in 1939, he became the choral director of the Wadsworth High School and continued in that capacity until his retirement in 1965. Fortunately, I've spoken before that I belong to the Methodist Church here in Wadsworth, and fortunately for us, being a Methodist, Mr. Sears was a part of that congregation and served as our choir director during that time also.
Busy man.
One of the things that Mr. Sears was noted for during his time was the choral presentations that were made, very lavish operettas and different types of concerts that were given at that time. And since we're meeting here in March at the time of St. Patrick's Day, I have this little picture here of McNamara's band, which was another one of Mr. Sears' innovations. Now, I mentioned that he was the choral director, but he combined his talents often with the band directors. And in this case, we have Harlan Thomas in the back, who at that time was the director of the Wadsworth High School Band. And Mr. Sears had his son, Kingsley Sears Jr. It's the first time he played a sousaphone. And this group was brought together for a concert called the Shamrock Swirl. They were so popular as a result of that performance that they did march in several parades and gave several other performances there.
You know, originally when I saw this picture, if we could put this back up again, I thought that this was a sign, but it's not.
Well, when I first saw it, I thought so also, and then I realized that it's wrapped around the bass drum.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the drummer, but in the front we have Ed Chernak and Al Dutt and Roger Dutt, and I mentioned Kingsley Sears Jr., and Ed Mason on the right, who's now a doctor in Michigan. And in the back next to Harlan Thomas is Donald Roberts and Donald Starling and Terry Krosky, and then, as I mentioned, Kingsley Sears.
They look like they had a lot of fun.
Well, bands have always played an important part in Wadsworth's activities, and someday we could probably do a whole show just on bands. But I thought it might be interesting to take a look at the transitions that the band's made through time. This is a picture of the Wadsworth Band on Main Street, about 1885. J.M. Browse is the director of the
right.
band with his big baton out there. And several of the mainstays of the bands, Bert Franks and Ira Razor, the Knopf brothers, Ed Geib, who they said could drink his tuba full of beer, and a lot of the other people that we've talked about in other instances through our various programs are pictured in that photograph. Now, the streets, thankfully, are in a lot better condition today
than they were back
than
then.
they were then.
Yeah, I guess.
This is a picture of the band again, just after the turn of the century. They're in front of the Myers Block, or what we would say is now that where Accurate and Holmesbrook are located.
Okay.
At that time, it was the South Room was occupied by the Myers Company, hence the name Myers Block, and that's why you see dry goods and cloaks there. And a lot of the older members of the band were bringing their sons in by this time.
Oh.
You might notice just out of the corner of the picture there, the words "You Are In." Well, that wasn't an urn store, that was furniture and undertaking, because as we've talked previously, Hilliard and Curry were located in that area where the Holmesbrook Supply is now.
The streets look like they're in the same shape as they were in the previous picture.
That's one way that you can help date that picture,
Oh.
because it has to be after 1905 because the Myers Block has been completed, and before 1907 because the streets haven't been paved, so 1906.
Wow. Your detective work here. Okay.
In 1929, the band was going to give a concert at the Central School Auditorium, and they posed for this picture. It was a publicity picture, actually.
I've got this. There we go.
Now, originally, we had bands before the Civil War, but people, as times changed, would lose interest, and it wasn't really resurrected until the 1880s. And at that time, they were called the Grand Army Band, taking their name from the Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans of the Civil War, and they wore the blue Civil War uniforms. Later, they were known as the Wadsworth Coronet Band, and during this time, just the Wadsworth Band.
Okay.
This is a picture of the band again. Now, by this time, they were known as the American Legion Band after the First World War, because the American Legion were the sponsors, and you notice they're wearing the hats that you might associate with a doughboy.
Yeah.
And they're again on Main Street, but we see the other side there.
Right. And the street paved, of course, because it's after 1907.
And again, this is the American Legion Band in the 1930s. They're on the lawn in front of the Central School. Now, the way the picture's taken, it looks like they'd be out in the middle of the street, but the lawn used to extend out much farther.
I see.
And notice the fire escape on the front of the Oddfellows building there. And this was a picture taken at the time of Wadsworth's 125th anniversary in 1939, the Wadsworth Band down on the stadium grounds.
Very nice.
Now, one other thing that, some other things that we might mention in connection with the month of March, as far as Wadsworth is concerned. We mentioned St. Patrick's Day, but Wadsworth was also founded on St. Patrick's Day of 1814. And another event that happened in March of 1933 was the repeal of Prohibition. I should say that wasn't actually repealed then, but that's when it came into effect in Wadsworth. And in March of 1933, for the first time in 25 years, Wadsworth residents could drink legally. Now, for those who are better at math than I am, they're saying, well, 25 years, that would be 1908. Prohibition didn't go into effect that early. But we've mentioned on a previous show that Wadsworth was a dry town legally long before Prohibition went into effect. So it wasn't until 1933 that Wadsworth residents could again drink legally. And at that time, they made an announcement that four of the places that had applied for licenses and had been given permission to sell 3-2 beer were Markley's Restaurant and Gerstenschlager's Restaurant that had previously been called Phillips Restaurant. Now that was on College Street. Markley's Restaurant was on High Street. The Sweet Shop and McCarthy's Restaurant in the South End. And another event that happened a long time before that, was the Great Sleigh Ride of 1856. Now, on March 14th of 1856, there was a challenge put out. The reason I mention this in connection with the repeal of Prohibition is because it came about as a result of drinking also. It was a very bad winter, and a lot of people were stranded in Cleveland. They couldn't get in or out. And a group of people from Summit, Cuyahoga, and Medina County were in a public house, and they got to drinking and talking about whose county could beat whose county. And they determined that the manly way to settle this would be to have a sleigh ride.
Given the snow conditions.
They'd been drinking, they weren't drunk. They weren't about to have a duel over it, but they decided that they would have a sleigh ride. And so the Great Sleigh Ride was called for the 14th of March. And whatever a pennant was made, and whatever county brought the most number of sleighs, four-horse sleighs, to the meet would win this pennant. Well, Summit County won with 171 four-horse teams. But Medina was not a good loser. And they determined that 4 days later, they were going to challenge this record that had been set by Summit County. So with 182 sleighs, they ventured forth to Akron. And they pulled a cannon along behind them and fired this cannon as they went over the hill to announce their arrival on the upper ridge of Akron. And got into town, and Akron, being a good sport, had to admit that Medina had won. And there was a good deal of celebrating again. But by the time they got around to leaving to head back to Medina County, back home, the snow had begun to melt. And the roads were covered with mud, and the sleighs didn't move very easily. So they had to prevail upon the good sports of Summit County to help them get back home safely. Now, one thing that's baffled historians through the years is what became of this pennant. And the last reports that were had was that it was given to a particular man in Medina to hold until such a time as any of the other challengers might come with more sleighs. And that's pretty much the way the history books left it. When this man died, when they tore down his house, they went in and searched, and no sign of this was ever found. But I have a document here, which is a rather interesting... Yes, I'm not going to try and read it all, but this was an address that was written for July 4th, 1876, the centennial of our nation's founding, in which is recounted the Great Sleigh Ride. And it concludes with the words that it is going to be given to the Agricultural Society. The flag was given by Medina County to the Agricultural Society of Summit County and would be kept there until 1976, our country's bicentennial. But whatever happened to it after that, it's been lost. But this is I think the people who were searching for it in that man's house or in the vaults of Medina
How did you come across this letter? It's beautiful handwriting. It looks like calligraphy, what we would term calligraphy now.
Well, that's the original speech that was given on that day, July 4th, 1876 in Summit County, and it was in a box of things I got at an auction.
And you had no idea when you got the box that was in it?
No, in fact, I don't even remember why I was going after. And that's why I've mentioned again and again that to me, that letter wasn't important because I didn't realize the significance of it until I got it home and read it. I was purchasing the box for something else. Sometimes things that seem insignificant on the surface really contain a great deal of information. Now, in connection with St. Patrick's Day, the only relic I have from Wadsworth is this little card.
I'll put this behind here so we can really see it.
Which is an invitation to an outing of the Wadsworth Rotary Club at Brookside Country Club on Tuesday evening, March 16th, 1926. And inside is written the invitation, which it's an attempt at the Irish brogue, and I won't embarrass myself or you by trying to imitate it. But the idea was that you would take your favorite Rotary Ann and go to the Rotary dinner at Brookside.
with your Rotary man, huh?
Now, that's the only item that I have that's really connected with St. Patrick's Day from Wadsworth. Fortunately, Gary Deem, the owner of Wadsworth Banner Printing, has made an offer I can't refuse. He has offered that as they print different programs or things of that nature, that they'll just put one aside. And that way I don't have to go around to every
Lounge
function,
around and beg and...
go to every
Why not?
potluck
Yeah.
and dinner, and I'll be bigger than I already am. But Banner Printing, incidentally, is one of our older businesses in town because it's an outgrowth of the Sun Banner Pride. Some people may not be aware that until Gary Deem moved the business across to Wautroosa Avenue, it had been the job printing department for the newspaper. And when the newspaper decided to do away with that type of work, Gary, who had been employed by them, took it across the street. But it dates back actually to the founding of our newspaper, because the newspaper in Wadsworth, the Wadsworth Enterprise, which was founded in May of 1866, was founded not as a newspaper, but as a job printing company, because the president of the Ohio Farmers Insurance Company, Reverend Thomas Browning, who was also a mayor of Wadsworth, and not a very pleasant sort, had a falling out with the Akron Beacon Publishing Company, and ordered the Root brothers to go to Cincinnati and purchase type and set up a print shop so that he could direct how he wanted his business forms printed. And as an outgrowth of this print shop, Wadsworth had its first newspaper. So there is a relationship there. Now, so often we run across photographs that are so hard to identify because of their age.
Yeah.
There just aren't a whole lot of people around who are able to identify them, as is the case with these school pictures here. We have several of them I brought just to illustrate. Now, there's Lottie Mills, incidentally, that we've talked before as a veteran school teacher in Wadsworth. But to get all of the names of these students after so many years is very difficult. Just go through the other ones if you like.
Sure.
And so we end up with boxes of photographs for which there's no identification.
Okay, I'll put another one up here. So it has a chunk taken out of it.
These pictures, incidentally, were taken down at the old Union School building on what is now the site of the Central Middle School.
And here's another one.
But for something I'd like to talk about now, we have kind of a different sort of a problem. This is a page from a clipping book in which has been pasted an old photograph, of a newspaper clipping of an old photograph.
Yeah.
During the 1950s and 1960s, Joe Klosterman began running memory lane photographs, and people would bring these in and they'd be run in the paper. And this is an example of the class of 1884 down at that Union School building. And we have all the names, but we don't have the photograph. The original photographs have disappeared. And I wanted to bring in a photograph that would be more suitable for television, but unfortunately it doesn't exist. But the reason that this is important, we talked earlier about Kingsley Sears, and I mentioned that his father was the Reverend Schuyler Sears. And this is Reverend Schuyler Sears, right in the center there with his hands folded in front of him. I think he was getting ready for, he had an inkling of his future vocation. He appears to be praying already. And of course, a lot of these children in the group were his school chums. Now, Reverend Sears was stationed or pastor at one time at the Elyria Methodist Church. And on a particular occasion, he was asked to speak to a group of school students on reflections about his boyhood, what it was like when he was a child. And he wrote a poem about the sleigh riding adventures of he and his chums on Brouse's Hill here in Wadsworth. Now, I should say, like many small towns, Wadsworth has had a lot of local poets. Most of them, like in most small towns, are very poor. But Schuyler Sears was actually a good poet, and he was published in quite a number of books. And as he would write poems through the years, many of which dealt with his boyhood in Wadsworth, they would be published in the paper. In his Brouse's Hill poem about his sled riding adventures was published in the paper in the 1920s. It was considered first front page material at that time. But he had a way about him of relating these things that you could really feel the emotion all those years later. He wrote most of his poems in the 1920s, and they related to his boyhood in the 1880s. Now, I mentioned Browse's Hill, and to some of our newer residents, they may not know exactly the location that I mean. The best way probably to describe it is at the intersection of the Water Tower and Akron Road, or Summit Street Extension, the newest part of Summit Street, and Akron Road. And at one time, this road was level with the house. There was a large house that sat before the Water Tower, and this was built by William Browse. Now, the Browses were pioneer settlers of Chippewa and Wadsworth Township, and owned much of the land in the northern part of Wadsworth. And in the 1880s, he built his home on that site. And as I said, the road ran level with the house, and the house was reached by a large circular drive. In the 1950s, the road was cut down twice, first 5 feet and then another 9 feet, and subsequent gradings have made it even lower, so that it's hard to imagine how steep this hill must have been originally. And of course, the Browse home is gone now. I'd like to share with you that poem that Schuyler Sears wrote about his boyhood, his sledding on Browse's Hill. And as I do so, I have a movie clip from the late 1930s that'll show people sled riding in the opposite direction. Instead of going down Akron Road, they're coming up Akron Road. The scene, it's hard to...
Yeah, I'm lost already here.
You're lost already. All right. You'll see a boy, as the film opens, you'll see a boy sled riding what looks like a small path. That path is Akron Road as it runs into High Street.
Okay.
This film came to me from Stanley Parker, who we've talked about previously. Mr. Parker died in January. But his father, L.E. Parker, was an official of the Ohio Match Company. And in 1919, he built a large brick home on the corner of Akron Road and High Street, on the site where the convenience store is now located. And most of these scenes that we'll see are taken from that vantage point on High Street. You'll see across Akron Road the Waltz Service Station, which was later purchased by Tom Gaertner, and then it became a Ohio Station, and a new station was built that became Tubby's Ice Cream, and is now Gary Lovelace's finance company there, financial investment company there. You'll see the Waltz House beyond that. Across the street, you'll see the large square Frank's farmhouse at that intersection. The colonial-style home that was originally the home of J. William Stonier, a longtime Wadsworth jeweler and a public official, and was later identified with Jim Westbrook, who was also an accountant. And then you'll see the scene move down High Street, through the snow, onto the square. You'll see some of the old snow-moving equipment there. The old Strand Theater, when it had a square marquee rather than a triangular-shaped one. There's a quick glimpse there of the E.J. Young Mansion, which was on the site of what is now the the United Methodist Church. Some people shoveling snow on Highland Avenue, and the snow plow coming down. If you notice, the man who's working the snow plow is not in any type of a cab. He's not in any way protected from the elements. I don't know if that was to encourage him to get his job done more quickly, or what. He didn't have the radio and the heater and all the other comforts. He wanted to get the snow plowed and be done. We have a picture of the Browse house.
That's beautiful.
And as you can see, the road runs level with the farm. That's William Browse on the right and his wife. And in the center is their grandson, who many people remember, Lloyd Browse. There were good times for Wadsworth boys some 40 years ago, when winter never failed to bring a foot or more of snow, And on the Akron road, this side of Weaver's cider mill, we fellows took our homemade sleds to slide on Brouse's Hill. There was an older bunch of boys, Will Warner, Charlie Farr, my brother Harry, and Ed Geib, each one a baseball star. And these would often make the rest contribute some great thrill, some great adventure for the day on Mr. Brouse's Hill. Bob Stevenson was right on hand. Ted Baldwin brought his sled. No other lad in all the town could ever outcoast Ted. And the Holben boys were on the job, Charlie and Joe and Will, and some few other ones there were, to slide on Brouse's Hill. If Wally Brouse had done his work, his father let him slide. He had a sled of ancient make, but it was fine to guide. Thus oft on Saturdays there came these lads of coasting skill, with caps, yarn mittens, scarfs, ear tabs, to slide on Brouse's Hill. These afternoons were all too short to grind such grists of fun, and we habitually deplored the early set of sun, except when Ollie Clifford's bob broke down and made a spill, and dumped us over in the snow, somewhere on Brouse's Hill. Sometimes each froze his exposed nose, sometimes we nearly died as marvelously we missed a team and almost did collide. Sometimes we frosted all our toes before we had our fill of sliding down and climbing up on Mr. Brouse's Hill. They say the road has been improved from what it used to be, and autos now by scores glide by, like ships upon the sea. But when the winter sifts the snow, and frosts with winds that chill, I long to ask those boys again to slide on Brouse's Hill.
Well, when did you commit that to memory? You didn't even read it, I noticed.
Well, I was afraid if I read it I might get tripped up on it. But it's such a beautiful piece, and it evokes so many memories of kind of a bittersweet remembrance of his childhood. And several of his poems, The Day McKinley Spoke, When Father Ground the Sigh, a lot of them have been published because they are not only reminiscent of a bygone era, but they show a particular style of poetry and writing. Like I say, he's one of the few good local poets that we had. A few other things we might mention about the film that we looked at. I mentioned that L.E. Parker had built that large brick house that was featured. Since it was their home, that's why it's featured so prominently, of course, in the film. But when the gas station, the Sunoco station, was built on that corner in the 1950s, they had to do something with the house. And they weren't quite up to tearing things down the way they are now then. But they didn't know what to do with it. It was such a large home and so substantially built. And so they moved it up to Baker Drive, which, if you think for a moment, that was a brand new allotment in the 1950s. And a lot of the people who were building their nice ranch-style, 1950-style home were not happy to see this big brick monstrosity moved in there. But it's blended in the neighborhood well and serves as an anchor for that area. But it's still a lovely home after all these years. Another thing that you might have noticed it towards the end, a gentleman removing a blanket from the radiator, from the hood of his car. Evidently had been trying to keep the engine warm, which some people still do today if you have to park outside. That appears to be the back of the Grace Lutheran Church. And I believe that that gentleman was the Reverend Dr. Eder, who was pastor of the church, and died in 1935 while he was addressing his congregation. And that appeared to be him, but since his head was somewhat averted, it was hard to tell. But there were a lot of scenes around town.
Oh, that was great.
I guess you're not going to get a job as a snowplow driver, though.
Not back then I wouldn't, maybe now.
We're kind of caught in the middle this month between St. Patrick's Day and Easter, since Easter falls early this year. And we've talked previously about, quite a bit I guess, about Franklin and Lincoln celebrating their anniversary. Well, they're doing so, I think it's such a wonderful thing that they're taking the pride in their schools and they're trying to promote their schools. And I've got a Lincoln School Frisbee, and I've got Franklin School pencils and buttons and books. And so I want to do all I can to help them promote what they're trying to do. And for Easter, we have a picture of the students in March of 1940. Easter was early that year also. in Alice Moffett Lieberth's class at Lincoln School. From the left, you have Wesley Clark and Teddy Selby and Patsy Overholt and Carolyn Mattoon and Dick Thompson and Ronald Campbell and Mary Jane Harden, showing the Easter baskets that they've made to take home. And this would probably be good news for students today as well as it was then. Today is Tuesday. Our Easter vacation begins tomorrow. I'm sure there was a hooray when that was put up on the board.
Exactly. Big smiles. Okay. Well, happy Easter to you.
And to you also.
And thank you for watching In Touch.